packet pushers.
Welcome to Day 2 DevOps, where the dev oops is in the details. I'm Kyler Middleton, and on Day 2 DevOps, we explore those details and how you can learn from the mistakes of others and build a solid DevOps and now data practice on Day 1 and beyond. With me on this journey of learning and doing is my co host, Ned Bellavance. Hi, Ned.
Hey, Kyler. Today on the episode, we're going to talk about some interesting data things and we're going to make heavy use of analogies. I say we, our guest is going to make heavy use of analogies. We're going to talk about how data doesn't lie, just like Shakira's hips. How collecting all of your data sets in one place helps you find the white truffle of valuable insights. What's the pig behind the truffle? You'll have to listen and find out. And finally, don't Swiss cheese your data. Don't carve holes in it. You should save it all so you can get the maximum value out of it or make a delicious sandwich. Who knows?
Guiding us through our quest for data nirvana is our guest, Dominic Chapman, the head of product at Axiom. Dominic is a data fanatic who's been fixated on how to store and operationalize every bit and byte of data. Did you see what I did there? Your application stack creates across every component, which is an impossibly challenging problem that he and his company are attempting to solve. With no further ado, let's talk about it.
Well, Dominic, welcome to Day 2 DevOps. We're very excited to have you here and lead us through the world of intergalactic data speak, whatever that means. Well, I guess we'll get to that. But first, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Dominic. I'm head of products at a company called Axiom. But I think the reason that we're talking here is because I've had quite a long career now within the data space, and I've probably become a little bit too obsessed with it. So I'm excited to share some of the reasons why I think data is important, explore some of the things that I've learned, and hopefully we can learn some things together.
Let's expand on that. What is it about data that you find fascinating?
Yeah, I definitely wasn't born this way. I don't think I grew up expecting to work in data. What is true is I've always wanted to work in technology. And so, personally, my career has been spent in the early stage venture backed startup ecosystem.
Hmm.
And that's a very specific world where the expectations are maybe different to other kinds of companies. I think in all of the companies I've worked at, I've been expected to essentially solve problems that really matter in the world to a large group of people and to solve them in ways that are unique and inspire lots and lots of people to use them very quickly. That's the kinds of products I've had to build. And I think after years in that world, and probably too many years at the beginning not realizing this, the truth was that the data never lies. If you are creating products that are resonating, the data will back that up. And if you're not, the data will horrify you. And I think there have been times when I've been building products where I didn't have the data to hand. It wasn't part of our strategy to be observing that data, and I paid the price for it. And so when I started paying attention, when I gave data a seat at the table, I think the companies that I've been part of have been better off. And sometimes you get to uncomfortable realizations faster, but I would rather that happen than build something that you maybe think is working well, but the data tells a different story. So that's why I think data is important. I think every company should be paying attention, and there's certain ways that we can make it easier for ourselves to pay attention to the right things.
You told us a story in the pre interview for this podcast about a situation where the power of data turned on the light. I love your use of analogy here. So, what is that story where it turned on the light, and what do you see differently now that you didn't before?
Yeah, great question. So it's definitely going back a lot of years now, but I promise you I can remember the feeling so vividly still. This is probably mid 2010s. I was building a social network. It was the second startup I was building in my career. And it was a community social network. We were trying to bring back community spirit in the digital age. That was the premise. Essentially, we'd built a membership of users in the hundreds of thousands around the UK where I live, where people were helping each other with neighborly tasks. And that was essentially the concept. But the reality of building that kind of product on web, iOS, and Android back in the days was that you might be getting positive feedback from time to time from people who were enthusiastic about the concept. It was a bit out there, and a few people were really excited about it. But I learned through actually a lecture series that I watched as part of Y Combinator's online startup school that there is a really important metric that you should be paying attention to, which is retention. And this probably isn't a dazzling insight these days, but back in those days, maybe it wasn't so easy to construct these kinds of queries. But essentially, I went down this huge rabbit hole of trying to configure analytics for our startup for the first time. We were three, four, five people total, probably. And I remember digging through the archives of different blog posts of data vendors that don't even exist anymore, trying to find that SQL query that would give us the insight that we needed. And there was no chat GPT back then. You couldn't pass it, the query that ran and didn't work and ask it to fix it for you. So it really was pulling the hair territory trying to figure out how to make this work. But as soon as we could see it, I can remember the moment where we finally had all of the event data pouring into BigQuery. It was back then. We'd got the SQL statement just right in Mode, the analytics tool that we were using. And it was really like somebody had turned the lights on. Suddenly these users who I knew by their, user ID, I could see what they were up to. I could see who was sticking around and who wasn't. And I think this is so critical for so many companies, is to have that insight into what is actually going on. And back then, I mean, these days I'm working with a different kind of data. I think it's more engineering related event data, like logs and distributed traces. And back then it was product analytics usage event data. But all of this data is the footprint that your users are leaving across your digital ecosystem. And I think if you can control that data, if you can first capture it, if you can organize it, and then you can put it in the hands of people who actually care enough to figure out what's going on, that's when data is this superpower for organizations. And frankly, the access, the intelligence that data can give us is not equally distributed across organizations out there. The big names that we know about, this is part of their daily lives. Huge percentages of organizations like Facebook, for example, will be tapping into data products daily across the entire organization. And I think that literacy and access is not always the case. And I hope that changes.
I was talking to one of our AWS TAMs that I work with frequently, and they said that for the help that I provide you, I have to justify it with data within like AWS. Like we're just having conversations, but she was like, we need to ground these conversations in data of the percent that I have helped you with this project,
Wow.
which sounded over the top. And so I wanted to ask, related to that, like, has this always been true? Is this like a technological limitation of we've always kept all the data that we can and now technology and allows us to keep more? Or is this a cultural shift that now we want to keep all the data? Now we're all starting to like collectively realize the power of this data? Or is it both?
I think there's definitely a cultural element. If we look around these days, our digital footprint is increasing all of the time. And I think there is a deep understanding that if we can collect that telemetry and we can see what people are up to when they're using our products in the right ways, right? We're not talking Cambridge Analytica style. We're talking actually trying to build better and more reliable and more valuable products for people. Yeah, I think there is an appreciation that data has that superpower. But I do also think that this is great news. I think data products are becoming more accessible. Generally speaking, let's say that there's three phases of the data lifecycle: collection, storage, and then actually querying. The first two parts, it's strange because I've actually lived in kind of two different worlds in my career: the data analytics world, which is built on systems that people have called the modern data stack. It's about using ELT, ETL pipelines to get data into analytics or data warehouses, and then using tools like DBT to do transformations on that data and ready it for consumers. And then there's this altogether different world, which I'm now in, which is around log management, observability, and specialized tools like SIM and SOAR for security. And those two worlds, for whatever reason, haven't come together. But on both sides, there is an appreciation that more data means more insight. So how can we reduce the cost and make it more accessible? But for both of those groups, the data analyst and then the more technical operational use cases, there is a very real problem that we have to solve, which is how do you make the data actionable? What's the last mile of this data to actually realize some insight? And I think on that front, there's developments too. We touched on ChatGPT earlier, but really these interfaces are changing so quickly. The way that I really imagine we'll be able to talk to data as the next step. Finally, I think people have tried for literally decades to make natural language querying possible, but I do think that's going to become a reality. And then I think there's going to be a phase after that, which is humans don't even need to be asking the questions anymore, and the intelligence can be revealed to us by the machine. So yeah, I think all of these things are coalescing for data to have a more prominent role in so many organizations, which is great to see.
You mentioned being in the data analysis world and creating data warehouses. And I've never done that myself, but I've been involved in projects where I'm working with data architects and analysts to kind of figure out what the structure of the data warehouse is going to look like. And it always felt very rigid. It felt very planned. And they're like, these are the tables and these are the dimensions that we're going to, analyze the data cube with. And it doesn't feel like, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like for the average business user, that is too rigid of a format.
Mm.
They can only get out of that these very narrowly defined fields that have been created. And people want to be able to, like you said, sort of query things in a more natural language kind of way and still derive value from the information that's stored in that warehouse. I don't know if I have a question, but that's just like an observation that I had.
I think it's absolutely spot on. And I mentioned those two worlds. Quite literally, the company I worked at before the company I'm working at now was living in that data analytics realm. I don't know what the best classification of it is, but in a nutshell, what it would mean is you're using things like Fivetran or Rivery for that ETL process. You're piping it into something like Snowflake or Databricks in tables, and then you're doing some kind of transformation over it to prepare it for probably a data science or a data scientist or analyst. That's one world. And then there's this, they seem so similar to me, but for some reason they just haven't been bridged. This altogether different world, which is dominated by players like Splunk or Elasticsearch, which is where do we send operational data, machine data, like logs and distributed traces. And I think you're absolutely spot on. For some reason, the second world that I described doesn't seem to have such strict schema requirements. There's an appreciation that that fluidity makes working with the data more approachable. But in the first world, there's these concerns around data governance and data lineage and ensuring that there's robustness around the data products that depend on these tables. That means it becomes really prescriptive
Hmm.
and I think quite strict. So it's funny, like the mission statement when I joined my current company from our leader was we need to try and bridge these worlds. And what we've done at the company I work at now is say, if you narrow to a specific class of data, you can provide that flexibility while supporting both of those different types of data, really. So I think it can change. It's probably a byproduct of the tooling that people leaned into for those different classes of data, is how I see it.
How much does it matter the type or the format of the data that's being ingested? Like, because I think of event logs as just being like a stream of just like JSON, basically.
Mm.
Here's an event in JSON. There you go. But that's not the way that all data enters in it. You could have just something that's firing off a metric like a sensor, and that's going to be a different stream of data. And then there's going to be more transactional things where, someone's completing a transaction on a website. So, like, what are the major kinds of data and what are the implications on the back end for ingesting it and then making it queryable?
Yeah, great question. So I think what I'll probably do is like double click on the second class of problem that I described before, which is this machine data or operational data
Hmm.
for more engineering or security related use cases. And I think in that ecosystem, the three major pillars that people will usually talk about are metrics, logs, and traces. So metrics would be coming off of compute resources and giving you a signal on the health, and they might be scraped at intervals, super high volume, frankly, metrics
Hmm.
to get that color. Logs are your system of record. They're the things that you write into your applications and services to understand precisely what's going on at a particular point, perhaps within your code. And then these distributed traces, I think, is a more recent idea. And for me, all they really are is a specific breed of log event. And the difference about distributed traces is that they include a property that allows you to map several logs across a distributed application. So we can say, this is the request lifecycle through this series of applications and services, and you can bring that back together in a cohesive view. But in terms of what it means for the architecture, the way that you would want to optimally store these different subcategories of what we call timestamped event data, that's the label that we give it at the company I work for, is different. And the way that you query those different kinds of data is different too. So the actual, if you think about the interface that you would be presented with to go and explore metrics data, it would look different from logs and different from traces. So these are the considerations. These three pillars are what has been termed as kind of like the observability pillars.
Hmm.
But actually, I think it's more helpful to think about them as different kinds of time-stamped event data. And if we narrow in on that problem, I think there are ways that you can build systems that make it far more efficient to store and then analyze all three types.
In the pre-interview, you talked about a ton of gems, but one of them was what would it mean for teams if they could collect every bit of telemetry data across their applications without concern for cost? And
Hmm.
I think that's a hypothetical question, but I want to ask it for real because, like, what would it mean if we capture all these different types of data and we don't have to worry about the cost? What can it do for us?
Yeah. I think one thing I just want to say up front on this point about what could we do, what is the potential that I wasn't so aware of before I was immersed in this particular space is just how seriously the major tech players take these kinds of data in terms of the value that they create for their organizations. When you think about the size of data growth in industry just for these kinds of logs, traces, and so on, it is actually in some ways like hard to imagine. We are talking, early 2000s when, vendors like Splunk really came into the market. It would have been common to be capturing tens of gigabytes or hundreds of gigabytes per day. We're now talking about tens of terabytes a day being the normal, right? And for organizations who are moving into more sophisticated technical problems like AI, easily producing hundreds of terabytes per day. And that might seem staggering.
Hmm.
But when we talk about a company like Netflix, who talk openly about the kinds of systems that they're building themselves internally, the figures are staggering. They're collecting just for logs 3 petabytes of log data per day, which I just can't even begin to imagine how that's even possible. And on the traces side, 370-ish terabytes of traces per day. So these numbers are just remarkable. The growth is enormous. And so, again, to your point, you have to ask why. Why are they bothering? Why are they committing the resources to trying to solve this challenge of capturing so much data? And I think the obvious reasons are that it helps us solve problems like understanding if our systems are healthy and whether our systems are performant. Have we been able to watch Squid Game successfully when we sit down on the sofa on an evening, right? It helps us make more informed product decisions. Have people actually been playing the games feature in Netflix that I can't imagine anyone actually using, but perhaps they do? Who knows? But I think there is something else going on that is really important here, that there is a bigger picture around what is possible with this event data. And for me, when I think about this system of record that is captured through these logs and traces, it is the defining and differentiated white truffle that every organization can capture and use. By which I mean, it is the unique insight that you have from all of the usage across human, sensor, and machines for all of your digital products that exist. This is the foundation for the technology that will allow organizations to become more autonomous, for one day all of us to do the things that we really want to do in life because our jobs have been supported with AI and all those good things. But the point I'm trying to make is if the companies that can capture this record of what's happening with their products are the ones that are going to be equipped with the predictive insight to understand what's going wrong, what's going well, what changes could be made, and how to optimize, it has to have a seat at the table. And like I said at the top, right now, access to the systems that allow you to collect these huge swathes of data are not equally distributed. The technology companies with, the biggest revenues can afford to have this kind of superpower. And I think it's about time that more companies had access to it. So to round that up, I suppose I would say there's the obvious stuff: system health, product analytics, proactive kind of detection of problems. But I think there's a bigger story going on here, which is if you can rein in this data and take control of it, it has such potential to help organizations make the right choices automatically.
I love the analogy of the white truffle because, you got to go hunting for it. You've got this vast forest of data and maybe there's truffles buried somewhere, but you have to rely on tools because human noses aren't sensitive enough to find it. So now we're farming out that work to something else. I don't know what that something else is in this analogy to root out that interesting information and find it for us. So in that analogy, if we can keep going with it, what is the pig in this regard that's finding those truffles for us?
Yeah, I mean, you look at that data growth that I just described, and I think the first thing that has to be obvious is that a human in the long run is not going to be the person who is finding the truffle.
No, no, you said 5 petabytes of data. I can't even get through like 500K of data in a day.
Exactly, right? And where do you begin to look? I mean, like that's actually the big problem I think now for teams like Netflix is okay, we've managed to, bring all of this data into one place, but how do our engineering teams actually make sense of what to look at?
Right.
That's the problem. And I think actually there's industries like the security industry that maybe point to where we're headed, which, you take SOAR as a product, for example, SOAR security systems. What are they doing in a nutshell? They're essentially scanning these event streams that arrive into systems of record, and they have pre-configured rules that say, if you see this, that could be bad. And all we're trying to do is bring insight to the people who can go and dig deeper, right? Escalate the things that matter. And I imagine a world where more of that will be true across all domains. We should have intelligence presented to us by the machine because anomalies become clear once you have sufficient data pouring in. And we should be able to detect the things that are going wrong before humans do, I suppose, as end users of our products and services. So that's the way I see the world going. I think there's a step in the middle where we make the insight more accessible. I talked about last mile earlier. We should be well past vendors like the tableaus of data visualization. We should be thinking about the ways that we can make building the right insights and making them accessible and collaborative more approachable. But I think eventually, I don't imagine a world where, as you said, 3 petabytes, I think it is per day, of log data is being trawled through by a human. It just doesn't seem in any way possible to me.
No, no. Wow, Tableau, that's a product that I have not heard anybody mention in a solid 8 or 9 years.
I should give them less props. They've acquired some companies that are doing cool things in the actually like the natural language analytics space. So I hope they do some good things with them. I would hate for those companies to die inside Tableau, but only time will tell.
Yeah.
I generally hear them brought up as like a necessary evil in order to access the data. So, yeah, there's for sure some gaps in sort of truffling your data.
Yeah.
Another analogy that you brought up was the bathtub of user retention. And what does that mean?
This one might be simple. It definitely goes back to that first company building, first serious company many, many years ago. I suppose realizing what it means to have stickiness and virality in a product.
Hmm,
I work in early stage startups and I think a lot about whether a company will succeed or fail. And I think the biggest predictor of whether a company will survive is if they have built a product that is magnetic or sticky. And the evidence of that is going to be for every person who comes through the door of your product or service, how many of them are still there in 30, 60, and 90 days?
mhm.
And the concept with the bathtub is back with that company I mentioned, ultimately we were finding new members by advertising in places like Facebook when it was really cheap to advertise on Facebook. You could get in front of people for a fraction of a penny. Times were good. But the reality is, if you're pouring marketing dollars into the top of a funnel through growth hacks or thinking that you're performing some growth hack or tactic that's going to lead to a great outcome for your business, if your retention curve, so if you think of a curve where on the left hand side, 100% of your users on day one are active because in their first day, that's always going to be true. And then you follow the curve out on the x-axis, the number of days since they joined the service, what percentage of them are still there on the y-axis. If that does not asymptote above zero, your bathtub does not have a good seal, right? The plug is open, and eventually you're going to have no users.
Right.
So you can predict what's going to happen in terms of the state of your business fairly early. After 30 or 60 days, you can see whether people are going to stick around. And history shows with these kinds of products that if people are there at 30 and 60 or 90 days, that's a really good signal that they're going to stick around longer. So I think the bathtub is just a quick kind of analogy I use to say, how sticky is your product? Have you sealed the bathtub? Are people going to stick around when they arrive through the door? And I think, unfortunately, for so many startups, they aren't solving a problem that's important enough or pressing enough for people to keep coming back. And the ones that win will. And like I said, the data will show it. So there's no hiding.
Data is the source of truth. Data doesn't lie.
Exactly. Yeah.
I really like the analogy that it doesn't matter how much money you spend on marketing and how much you are out there shaking hands and bringing people to your bathtub if it's not sealed, because it does not matter. Like that money's just lost if you're not retaining those users. That's a very solid analogy.
Absolutely. And there's obviously a positive spin to this as well. I don't want to be a pessimist, right? As soon as you discover it is sealed, if you are in a venture business, that is the time to pour those dollars in or turn on the tap, right? Because if they're
Right.
going to stick around, the lifetime value's there and you can realize a good outcome. So there's a positive story as well, for sure. Yeah. Don't want to lose that point.
Moving back to more of an operational standpoint and like looking at events and sort of that kind of thing, How do we make that raw event data actionable?
When I think about the story and the life cycle of this event data, the first thing that we need to have is a way to get the event streams in. In the case of these like logs and traces, I actually think this is a fairly solved problem. There are great observability pipelines that make it very simple to collect telemetry from all kinds of apps and services. So it's important that the stores or the tools that we use for analysis are broadly compatible with the popular options. So the vectors, the fluent bits, the fluent Ds, these kinds of things. I think that is generally speaking sorted, and it's not effortless, but for the most part, it's very doable. I don't see teams struggling there. I think the next thing to make things actionable, which is maybe a different perspective, I think you need to have a unified data store. I think you need to be collecting more kinds of event data for different functional use cases in one place. I think the separation between tools that we use for logging and tools that we use for distributed traces and tools that we use for security event is a little bit silly, because when you look at the query patterns of the users who are actually inside these tools, what you'll often find is they look so similar. The user entity behavioral analytics workflow that you might be doing as a security analyst to say, where did this user go throughout my network, looks very similar to the behavioral analytics workflow that a product manager would build when they're trying to study whether somebody actually successfully closed a transaction in a checkout. And so I think once you understand that, you recognize that using those kinds of unified stores allow us to reveal like more intelligence. I think there is a big question about actually choosing the kinds of infrastructure choices and techniques to be able to collect and store this data affordably, which is worth talking about as well. But assuming you have that, assuming that critical piece is in place, the final piece I think is making the analysis layer friendly.
Hmm.
Not every user is going to be technical. We have people using the products that I work day to day where technical teams will maybe receive input from a less technical support team. And it's important that all of those groups can talk together and use data as a shared insight. So how do we make those analysis layers more approachable to more people? And we've talked a little bit about that with the natural language querying and the query builders that you see in some types of products. But ultimately, to make data actionable, you need that last mile to be solid. People have to be able to derive actionable insights from the data we're collecting, or all of this is definitely pointless.
Oh my goodness, I couldn't agree more. I have tried to work with Azure monitoring before. Sorry, I'm going to throw you under the bus, Azure monitoring. And it uses KQL, custom query language, and I find it completely inscrutable.
Mm,
It is just the syntax and the way that it approaches building a query is just anathema to me.
mm.
And the only way I can write a reasonable query is to go to ChatGPT or similar, tell it the query I want to write, and then have it transform that into something that I can copy and paste into Azure Monitor and hopefully get something that's close. So, putting a friendlier front end on a very technically sophisticated system is huge.
Yeah.
Like, game changer if you can do it right.
Yeah, and I'm very familiar with KQL Kusto, and I think the reasons are very solid for moving away from something like SQL when you're working with these types of machine data. Kusto as a piped processing language maybe took inspiration from things like Splunk's SPL, and the ability to start from a very broad search and then narrow down into a subset and apply, aggregations through these piped clauses is actually a really elegant way once you are familiar with the syntax. I think one of the problems with Azure data monitoring, if there's any product folk out there working in the team, is we need the examples to be embedded, or as you said, put a layer over the top of those kind of query languages that's more approachable. There's no reason that that natural language interface that you're using in ChatGPT can't be integrated into the product to actually produce the query for you. Ultimately, it's just an API to access and retrieve relevant data, right? So completely with you. I think there's more to do there for sure.
I like this idea of being the expert and working hard to, first of all, make sure it works as the expert. You must make sure things are laced together. But second of all, working on making it more accessible for everyone else. That sounds very much like the sort of concept of DevOps, as I understand it, is like do the hard things and solve them and then build tools that make it easier for everyone else to reap the value too. And I think that's just a trend we see in a lot of these spaces. Like your job is to be an expert, but your job is also to lower the bar for the people around you. It sounds like that's what your goal is as well.
Yeah.
You mentioned something about the cost of storing all this data. And one thing that I've heard from listeners and just talking to folks in the industry is like their bill for storing, logging, and monitoring data is like almost as big as their cloud bill for running the application.
Mm.
And like when we're talking about petabytes of data being generated every day, how do you store that effectively and economically?
I think there are a few different approaches that I can definitely share. The first one, which I say partly in jest, but it's an unfortunate reality for a lot of organizations, is you could not keep it. You could absolutely filter the data, you could sample the data, you could bin it entirely.
Hmm.
And I think the intent was good from vendors who encouraged this. There's one in particular, an observability pipeline product that was presented as a solution to the Splunk cost problem, which is Splunk is a vendor that's known to be particularly expensive. Similarly, Datadog, it's probably the most common pain. Brilliant products, by the way, but unfortunately, the cost is just extortionate. This was presented as a potential solution. Let's just bin the data. Now, I would say this is not the approach. I think that is a band aid to an important problem, which is growing and uncontrollable cost. But I think there are better options out there. Another option, so you could throw it away, you could discard it, is you could reduce the retention. You could reduce how long you hold on to that data for. So in the case of Netflix, for their logs, I think they're tending to hold between 2 weeks and 6 months. But for traces, it's only 2 weeks. So they've kind of identified, I suppose, that Netflix moves on. Squid Games isn't as popular anymore and they don't need that data
Right.
forever. So that's an option. I think that's use case dependent. In the security world, low and slow attacks are a very real thing, and throwing away logs that could contain critical insights later is just not an option. You could definitely try different tiering strategies. That's another option that people have lent towards. So you could keep some data hot on disk, you could keep some data cold, in Glacier tiers and object storage. So these are options. But I think the reality is that architecture has moved on from the time that players like Splunk were invented, and that there are better options out there. So the company that I work for today, a lot of the folks who work at that company had lived through that exact problem that you described. They had
Hmm.
built a previous analytics product and they were depending on a service to capture the events. And it was going to cost them more for that Splunk license than the rest of their operating costs combined. So
Wow.
it wasn't an option. So they asked themselves, what would it look like to build a more efficient store of this data? And they did it by using the best parts of the cloud that didn't really exist when, players like Splunk came to market. And so just to give you the highlights of the kind of technology that we're proud to have built today, it really comes down to an ingest process that's radically different, a storage process, and a querying process. So on the ingest side, we have an ingest pipeline that's coordination free, durable by default. The big money saver is no Kafka. So ask yourselves the question, do we need all those components that everyone knows are expensive, or can we think about it differently? On the storage side, we reach for object storage exclusively. But because we narrowed the problem space to time-stamped event data, we've actually written a block format that compresses this event data far more effectively. It's a different kind of binary format, I suppose, on that object storage. And then on the querying side, if you look at the query architectures of things like the Splunks of this world when they came to market, long running query containers that have to sit idle waiting for the queries that user groups may come to the system with. In our case, we use serverless runtimes exclusively for all querying. So the compute that we need to answer a question about the data are spun up as they're needed, but they're ephemeral and they're torn back down when they're not in use. So across every component of this collect, store, and analyze stack for event data, we've asked the question, how can you make this orders of magnitude more affordable? And the reality is that what this means for organizations that are collecting this telemetry is they're no longer priced out. They don't have to have Swiss cheese data that has gaps in it because they've kind of just thrown it away at the recommendation of these band aid vendors. And they can afford to have the insights that they need to hand to make the most important decisions. And I think that's how you can really address this problem from first principles, is revisit the architecture that you're using to solve these kinds of problems and come at it with a new angle. And we're not the only ones. There's other vendors who are thinking about similar problems and they've got their own approaches. But the reality is, start by believing that better is possible, that you don't have to be, caught up in these expensive license renewals with these vendors, and take a peek at what's out there. Because I think there are vendors who are keeping up with this growth in data volume. volumes. So that's one of the reasons that I'm excited about this space, I suppose, is because I believe this is all still possible, even with those 3 petabytes a day.
Well, let's start to wrap this up, but we have one final question. We asked this of everyone because we're legally required to in 2025, but we didn't talk a lot about AI other than maybe using ChatGPT as a front end for writing some queries. So when you have, multiple petabytes a day of data, is AI going to be able to read this data and solve this problem in an elegant way, or is it not the right tool for this job? Or where do you see the place of AI in these big data problems?
Yeah, I suppose I would like circle back to the point about that white truffle. For me, when you think about these systems of records that we're collecting, I think of logs and traces as kind of the data exhaust coming out of the products and services that we're creating. It's everything that gets emitted through use. I think this is the context window that organizations can collect for AI that will really allow unique and powerful data products to be built. So, just to bring it into practical terms, you can see a lot of vertical AI products being built right now that are, replacing roles that would previously have been entirely human. So, you can think about kind of sales type roles where outreach is done by robots now, effectively. Imagine if those kinds of tools had complete insight into what the prospect or target was doing after that interaction. Did they sign up? Did they actually come back in 30 days? Was the bathtub sealed for them? All of this intelligence can be piped back in to reinforce that AI's understanding of that prospect or target. And I think this applies across all functions. Event data is going to be that foundational element that helps these models make the right decisions and have the context it needs. So I think it has a huge role to play. I think there's more work to do to be able to provide such high volumes of data continuously into these models. So that's, I think, what's next, really. One of the things I'm excited for.
Yeah, for sure. Before we wrap up, I did tease at the very beginning the idea of intergalactic data speak. It's another one of your analogies, and it would be a disservice to the listener if we didn't expand on that. So, can you just briefly describe what you think of as intergalactic data speak?
I want to give a shout out to a very strange and unusual research paper I read because actually I think it may have been from there or they referenced it.
Okay.
There is a research paper. I really recommend reading it. I thought it was fascinating. It's called A Social History of Database Populism, I think. And the idea is really the history of databases. Where did they come from? And SQL is a part of that. Why did SQL emerge as the interface for exploring structured data in relational databases? And I think what's super neat about SQL is even as early as, the late 20th century, it offered that interoperability across systems that at the time had no ability to connect with one another. It was the universal language to talk to data. And we talked about Kusto. I think that is changing, but interfaces with data are interesting. It's cool that SQL won and became that data speak. I think the data speak, the language that we talk to with data, is going to change and shift. And I'm really excited to see where that goes because I don't think it's going to be humans writing those queries for much longer. So it'll be fun to see which data speak comes next.
Excellent. Well, we'll keep an eye out for that. Dominic, thank you so much for being a guest today on Day 2 DevOps. If folks want to hear more from you, where's a good place for them to go and reach out?
Usually LinkedIn or Twitter. I'm Dominic Chapman on all of those socials. So find me there, connect with me. I'd love to hear from folks if any of the problems have resonated or maybe they've faced similar things themselves.
Okay.
And will you potentially be starting an analogy writing service for pay on Fiverr or something? Like, can I reach out for that in the future?
Absolutely. I would love that.
Awesome. Well, Dominic, thank you once again for being a guest today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to Dominic for appearing on Day 2 DevOps, and virtual high fives to you, dear listeners, for tuning in. If you have suggestions for future shows, we would love to hear them. Really, we really, really would. Hit either of us up on LinkedIn or send some feedback via packetpushers.net/follow-up. You can find me, Kyler Middleton, blogging on letsdodevops.com and my stupendous co-host Ned Bellavance at nedinthecloud.com. And we're both terminally active on LinkedIn. Stop by and say hello. If you are a vendor and you've got a way cool cloud product you want to share with our audience of IT professionals, please become a Day 2 DevOps sponsor. You'll reach several thousand super cool listeners, all of whom have problems to solve. Maybe your product fixes their problem, but they'll never know unless we tell them about it. Find out more at packetpushers.net/sponsorship. Until next time, just remember that doing DevOps is awesome, and so are you.